You thought the darkest secrets of the elite were just rumors, right? But what if I told you the world's most powerful people have been playing a terrifying, deadly game for centuries, hunting humans for sport? Dive into the chilling, blood-soaked history of royal hunts, where the prey was always one of us. And you might be next. Chapter 1. The Myths of Ancient Royal Hunts. Whispers of terror shrouded the ancient desert sands. The empires of the past, vast, powerful, and shrouded in mystery, left behind stories that echo with blood and cruelty. It was not uncommon for the rulers of these early civilizations to show their dominance through hunts. But what was whispered in the shadowed corners of ancient temples, behind the towering walls of palaces, was far more sinister. In the time of the Egyptian pharaohs, it is said that hunts were not limited to wild beasts. There are chilling stories of slaves, rebellious, defiant, or simply unlucky, set loose like prey in the endless expanse of the dunes. Their only hope of survival was to outrun their fate, while their masters, draped in gold and surrounded by royal guards, watched with cruel amusement from their chariots. Beneath the scorching sun, these slaves ran for their lives, knowing that once the pharaoh's hunting party released its dogs and arrows, there would be no mercy. The most terrifying stories tell of a pharaoh whose thirst for blood was insatiable. Every year, it is said, dozens of men and women were selected, those who dared to look at him wrong, or who had spoken too loudly in the markets. These people were stripped of their clothes and forced into the vast wasteland. They were given a head start before the pharaoh's elite warriors, mounted on horseback, thundered after them, armed with spears and arrows, like gods come to mete out divine punishment. The deaths were more than just punishment for petty crimes. It was a spectacle. As the myth goes, the pharaoh reveled in their terror, feeding off their fear as if it were sustenance. A cruel ruler toying with lives like a child tearing the wings from flies. No one dared speak out. The pharaoh was a god among men, and his will was law. But to the common people, huddled in their homes at night, the air was filled with terror. Stories passed through the streets, shared in hushed tones. Who would be next? Who would the pharaoh select this time? Would it be them, their father, or a brother? Across the Mediterranean, in the grand arenas of ancient Rome, there are tales of even more brutal hunts. The emperors, seated atop their gilded thrones, were notorious for their sadistic pleasures. While the crowds cheered in the Colosseum as gladiators fought to the death, few knew of the darker games that happened after the lights dimmed. In the secret depths of the palace gardens, behind thick marble walls, slaves were not gladiators, they were the hunted. It is whispered that Emperor Commodus, with his insatiable lust for blood, orchestrated these secret hunts. The emperor, known for his erratic and violent tendencies, would handpick his prey from among the captured slaves and criminals. At night, under the cover of darkness, he would release them into the vast expanse of the imperial gardens, a sprawling maze of marble, statues, and shadows. Armed with a bow and dressed in a lion's skin, Commodus himself would stalk these men, relishing the thrill of the hunt. His laughter, they say, could be heard echoing through the halls as he toyed with his prey, allowing them brief moments of hope before ending their lives with a single arrow. Commodus was not alone in his depravity. Other emperors, Caligula, Nero, were said to have indulged in similar games, where human lives were the ultimate trophy. These hunts were not for the eyes of the public, but were private, monstrous affairs, reserved only for the most elite of Rome's society. There was no escape for the hunted. Even if they survived the emperor's bow, they would be torn apart by his prized hunting dogs. Their screams were lost to the night, drowned out by the howls of the beasts and the sadistic laughter of their masters. Some say that the origins of these games lie in even older civilizations, back in Mesopotamia, where the kings ruled with iron fists and the punishment for rebellion was swift and brutal. There are stories, dark and half-forgotten, of kings who would take captured rebels into the mountains under the guise of mercy. The rebels, tied and bound, were set free into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The king would give them a head start. The hunters, handpicked by the king, would follow. These hunts were not just sport, They were a demonstration of power. The mountains would echo with the cries of the hunted, their bodies never to be found again, swallowed by the jagged rocks and thick forests. The king's men would return with bloodied spears and smiles stretched wide across their faces. The message was clear: resist, and you would be hunted like an animal, your body left to rot in the wilderness as a warning to others. How many slaves, how many prisoners were sacrificed in these brutal games? How many lives were snuffed out for the amusement of kings and emperors? The line between myth and reality blurs, but the fear remains. Whether it was the pharaohs of Egypt, the emperors of Rome, or the kings of Mesopotamia, one thing is certain: those in power have always wielded it like a weapon, and for those unlucky enough to be caught in their sights, the hunt was always fatal. In the stillness of the night, one can almost hear the sound of the chariots, the thundering hooves, the barking of dogs, and the terrified screams of the hunted echoing across time. The stories of these hunts may be ancient, but the terror it inspires is eternal. Chapter 2: Medieval Bloodlust. The medieval forests were thick with shadows, the trees towering and ancient, their branches twisting like the gnarled fingers of forgotten gods. Within these darkened woods, the aristocracy rode out in the dead of night, their horses snorting and stamping, eager for the chase. But the quarry they sought was not always the deer, the boar, or the wolf. Whispers from the peasant villages claimed the lords had developed a darker taste, a thirst for human blood. At the heart of these tales stood the feudal lords, men who held the power of life and death over those who toiled on their lands. It was a cruel system, and the lords were its cruel masters. The peasants were little more than cattle in their eyes, their labor feeding the wealth and leisure of the aristocracy. But when a peasant failed in his duties, when he dared to question the brutal taxes or faltered under the crushing weight of his debts, something far more terrifying than starvation awaited him. In the depths of medieval Europe, it was said that certain lords delighted in exacting punishment through the most macabre of methods, by turning their rebellious subjects into prey. Under the cover of darkness, the peasants were dragged from their hovels, bound in chains, and taken into the forests. There, they were released like animals, their chains broken, their breaths ragged with fear. Their only chance of survival lay in the slim hope of outrunning the lord's hunting party. But hope was a fragile thing in those deep woods. The hunting horns would blare through the night, and the lords, adorned in their finest hunting garb, would ride forth, the bloodlust gleaming in their eyes. They carried spears and bows, their hounds baying at their sides, eager to join the chase. It was a twisted game of sport, man against man, but the scales were never balanced. The peasant, barefoot, would run through the underbrush, his feet cut and bleeding on the jagged stones and thorns. Behind him, the lords rode in perfect unison, their laughter cutting through the silence of the woods like a blade. One of the most infamous stories comes from the legend of King John of England, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his arrogance. According to the tales that have been passed down through the centuries, King John was not content with hunting mere animals. No, his hunts required a more intelligent prey, those who had betrayed him, the traitors who dared defy his crown. It is said that in the dense forests surrounding his estates, King John would unleash these men into the wild, giving them only a brief head start before setting his hounds and knights upon them. The hunted men were not criminals in the true sense of the word. Often, they were political enemies, rivals, or simply those who had fallen out of favor with the tyrannical king. They knew that once they were released into the forest, their fates were sealed. The stories describe these hunts as pure carnage. King John, gripped by madness, would ride at the front of his hunting party, his sword gleaming in the moonlight. His laughter was said to be the last sound his victims heard before his blade found their flesh. Even as the peasants told these stories in trembling voices, the lords reveled in the power such legends afforded them. The mere suggestion that a lord might hunt a man for sport kept many in line, silencing dissent and fueling fear. It was not just about the chase, it was about control. To be a lord was to own the lives of others, and there was no greater demonstration of that power than the hunt. In the far reaches of Europe, similar tales emerged. There was the baron of a remote castle in the Carpathian Mountains, a man known only as the Black Hunter. His name was spoken in hushed tones, for he was said to be more beast than man. The peasants believed he had made a pact with dark forces, trading his soul for the thrill of the hunt. It was said that on nights when the moon was full, the baron would ride out, his face hidden behind a mask made of wolf's fur, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He would select his prey from among the villagers, those who had failed to pay their taxes or who had simply caught his eye. These unfortunate souls were stripped of their clothes and forced to run through the thick, tangled woods that surrounded the baron's castle. Behind them, the Black Hunter would ride, his dogs snapping at their heels, his crossbow ready. The legend claims that he never missed his mark. The baron would take his time, letting his prey believe they might escape, only to bring them down with a single shot. Their bodies were left to rot in the woods as a warning to the others, their bones gnawed clean by wolves and other predators. The Black Hunter was not alone in his depravity. In France, there were stories of noble families whose estates were said to echo with the screams of their human prey. These hunts were held in secret, far from the eyes of the common folk, but the rumors spread nonetheless. It was said that the nobles would hold lavish feasts after the hunt, where they would regale each other with tales of their kills, toasting their victories with goblets of red wine. To them, the hunted were little more than entertainment, a way to break the monotony of their privileged lives. Even the church, a symbol of hope and salvation for many, was not immune to the dark allure of the hunt. There were tales of corrupt bishops who indulged in these twisted games, using their power to protect themselves from scrutiny. One such bishop, it was said, would host secret hunting parties in the dense forests surrounding his cathedral. The victims were chosen from among the poor and the destitute, those whose disappearances would go unnoticed. The bishop and his fellow hunters would ride out at night, their horses trampling the undergrowth as they pursued their helpless prey. It is said that the bishop took particular pleasure in the hunt, believing that the act of taking a life brought him closer to the divine. These stories may seem like nightmares, the stuff of legend and folklore, but for those who lived in fear of their lords and masters, they were all too real. The forests, once a place of refuge, became symbols of terror, the dark trees hiding horrors that few dared to speak of openly. For the peasants, survival meant more than just tending their crops or paying their taxes. It meant avoiding the gaze of their lord, never giving him reason to turn them into prey. In the end, the medieval lords were more than rulers, they were predators. And for those who lived beneath their shadow, the sound of a hunting horn in the distance was enough to send chills down their spines. For they knew that in the medieval world, sometimes the hunter was not chasing a deer. Sometimes he was chasing something far more valuable, a human life. Chapter 3. The Renaissance's Shadow Games. The Renaissance, a time of art, beauty, and intellectual rebirth. Yet beneath the veneer of elegance and culture, there were darker currents that swirled through the courts of Europe. In the dimly lit chambers of grand palazzos, behind heavy velvet curtains and tapestries, whispers of secret hunts began to spread. The very same noble families that funded masterpieces and sponsored great thinkers were rumored to indulge in perverse pleasures that defied the light of day. Among these whispered secrets was the most chilling of all, the hunting of humans. In the sun-dappled streets of Florence, Venice, and Rome, rumors clung to the air like smoke. Behind the grand facades of Renaissance art and culture, there was talk of noble families engaging in strange and horrifying games, conducted far from the eyes of the common people. Some of the most powerful families in Italy, the Medici, the Sforza, the Orsini, were said to hold gatherings that began as lavish feasts but descended into something much darker as the night grew long. It was said that after the wine had flowed and the guests were in a state of feverish delight, a select few were invited to a special event, an event that would never be spoken of in polite company. The participants were sworn to secrecy, bound by blood oaths and threats of violence. Those who accepted were taken to hidden gardens or deep into the countryside, where the air was thick with the scent of night-blooming flowers and fear. There, under the cover of night, the hunt would begin. The prey were often young men and women, peasants, prisoners, or even members of rival families. They were stripped of their clothing and their dignity, forced to run through the maze-like hedges and groves, their bare feet slapping against the cold earth. The hunters, dressed in ornate velvet and silks, adorned with jewels and carrying finely crafted crossbows, would set off in pursuit. For the prey, there was no hope of escape. The gardens were carefully designed to disorient, to confuse, to trap. The paths twisted and doubled back on themselves, leading the victims straight into the hands of their pursuers. Whispers from the court of Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, and one of the most powerful women of her time, spoke of strange entertainments held within her private gardens. Known for her political cunning and ruthless ambition, Catherine was no stranger to manipulation and intrigue, but the rumors that surrounded her went far beyond mere political maneuvering. It was said that in the dead of night, beneath the moonlit sky, she hosted hunts that were not meant for animals. The Queen's estate, with its winding paths, hidden groves, and towering walls, became a hunting ground. According to the dark tales that circulated among the servants and lesser courtiers, Catherine and her trusted circle of nobles would release prisoners, those who had fallen out of favor, or who were merely unlucky enough to be chosen, into the labyrinthine gardens. Armed with bows, the nobles would hunt them down, reveling in the thrill of the chase, the power they held over life and death. The stories painted Catherine not as a queen, but as a predator, a woman who found pleasure in the screams of those who ran through her gardens, terrified and desperate for escape. The victims, it was said, had no chance. The walls of the garden were too high, the paths too narrow. Even if they managed to hide, the dogs would find them, dragging them from their hiding places to be dispatched by Catherine's favorite courtiers. The hunts were a display of dominance, a reminder that no one, no matter their rank or standing, could escape the Queen's power. But these dark games were not confined to Italy. In the shadowed halls of the chateaux along the Loire River, similar rumors flourished. Certain French noble families, known for their wealth and influence, were said to indulge in secret societies where human hunting was the ultimate test of their prowess and cruelty. These gatherings were not mere hunts. They were rituals cloaked in mysticism and dark symbolism. The hunted were not just victims, but offerings, sacrifices in a game that blurred the line between sport and ritualistic murder. The victims of these hunts were often young, healthy, and strong, the kind of prey that would provide the most exhilarating chase. They were not prisoners, just regular people. They were chosen for their ability to run, to fight, to survive, at least for a time. But survival was a cruel illusion. Once the hunt began, the noble hunters showed no mercy. They took pleasure in the fear, the screams, the frantic attempts to escape. It was not about the kill, but about the power, the control, the knowledge that they could take life at will. These secret hunts were shrouded in superstition, and it was said that the participants believed they were partaking in ancient rites passed down through generations of aristocracy. The hunt was a way to connect with something primal, something that transcended the art and culture of the Renaissance. In those dark, moonlit woods, the nobility became something more than human, something savage, something ancient. And then there was the matter of the disappearances. In the towns and villages surrounding these grand estates, people began to vanish. The peasants, ever fearful of their lords, dared not speak openly of the strange happenings, but the truth could not be hidden. Young men and women would go missing, never to be seen again. The lucky ones, it was said, were sold off to other estates, but the unlucky ones were hunted. Their bodies, if they were ever found, were mangled beyond recognition, discarded in shallow graves, or left for the wolves to find. In the courts of Renaissance Europe, appearances were everything. The nobility wore their wealth and power like armor, presenting a facade of grace and refinement. But beneath that facade lurked a hunger for blood, for dominance, for the thrill of the hunt. The Renaissance may have been a time of enlightenment and beauty, but it was also a time of shadows, where the darkest desires of the aristocracy were indulged behind closed doors. The great painters and sculptors immortalized the faces of kings and queens, princes and dukes, capturing their elegance and nobility for all of history to admire. But the canvas could never show what lay beneath the surface, the blood-stained hands, the cruelty hidden behind those regal smiles. The Renaissance was an age of beauty, yes, but it was also an age of nightmares, where the most civilized men and women could become the most monstrous of predators. Chapter 4. The Dark Rituals of the 18th Century. The 18th century was an age of reason, of enlightenment, of grand philosophical ideas. But while the salons of Paris and the courts of Europe buzzed with talk of liberty and progress, there were rumors that not all the nobles embraced these ideals. In shadowy corners of the palaces, behind the doors of private estates, strange and grotesque rituals persisted, rituals tied to the most macabre of indulgences. Amidst the elegant parties and intellectual debates, dark whispers told of hunts that defied the boundaries of civilized society, where the prey was not the deer or the boar, but human beings. It was said that beneath the glittering chandeliers of Versailles, where the courtiers of King Louis XV laughed and danced, another kind of revelry took place in the secret gardens and hidden hunting grounds of the aristocracy. The decadence of the French court was legendary, but there were tales of unspeakable horrors carried out by a select few among the nobility. The king himself, some whispered, was no stranger to these blood-soaked pursuits. In the shadowy alcoves of Versailles, the aristocrats would gather after the grand masquerade balls, their faces still hidden behind delicate masks of gold and silk. They would retreat to private chambers where the festivities took on a far more sinister tone. Once the doors were locked and the candles burned low, the masks came off, and the true nature of their entertainments was revealed. According to the stories, prisoners, often political enemies, or those who had been forgotten in the dungeons of the king's justice, were dragged from their cells and brought before the assembled nobles. The prisoners were stripped of their rags, their eyes wide with fear, as the aristocrats drew lots to see who would partake in the night's hunt. Those chosen for the game were taken to a secluded hunting ground deep within the forest of Versailles. Under the light of a pale moon, the aristocrats, dressed in the finest hunting attire, their boots polished and their horses sleek, would set off into the night. The prey, barefoot, starving, and disoriented, would be given a brief head start, but it was nothing more than a cruel jest. There was no escape from the nobles' hounds, whose growls echoed through the trees like the sound of death itself. It was not the kill that interested the hunters, but the chase, the thrill of watching their prey stumble and fall, of hearing the screams echo through the forest as the hounds closed in. The aristocrats would toy with their quarry, allowing them to believe, for a fleeting moment, that they might escape, before bringing them down with an arrow or a thrust of the spear. The bodies of the fallen were left in the woods, hidden beneath the leaves and soil, where the wolves would feast upon them by morning. But it was not only in France that these dark rituals took place. In the blood-soaked lands of Eastern Europe, far from the salons and philosophers of the West, there were even darker stories. Tales of noble families whose bloodlines were steeped in cruelty, whose estates were said to be cursed. Among the most infamous of these was the tale of Countess Elizabeth Bathory, a Hungarian noblewoman whose name still echoes with fear to this day. The Countess, it was said, was obsessed with beauty and youth, believing that the blood of young girls held the secret to eternal life. Her castle, perched high in the mountains, was a fortress of horrors. Inside its stone walls, Bathory and her trusted servants would lure peasant girls to their deaths, under the guise of offering them work or shelter. Once inside the castle, the girls would vanish, never to be seen again. Some whispered that Bathory's cruelty extended beyond mere torture and murder. She did not simply drain the blood of her victims, she hunted them. In the forests surrounding her castle, it was said that the Countess would release her captives into the wilderness, giving them a fleeting chance at survival. As the terrified girls ran through the dense woods, Bathory would follow, her laughter echoing through the trees as she rode her horse with a predatory grace. Her dogs, trained to hunt humans, would catch the scent of the girls and drag them down, their screams swallowed by the thick undergrowth. Bathory's sadistic games did not stop there. There were rumors that the Countess had her own secret hunting lodge, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, where she would invite noble guests to participate in her twisted hunts. Together, they would ride through the snow-covered forest, their cloaks billowing behind them as they pursued their prey. The girls, barefoot and freezing, would run until their legs gave out, collapsing into the snow as the nobles closed in, spears and arrows ready to deliver the final blow. These hunts, according to the stories, were not just about death, but about power, about reminding the peasants and lower classes of their place in the world. The aristocrats were untouchable, their wealth and status giving them the right to indulge in whatever horrors they desired. The peasants were nothing more than playthings, their lives worth less than the hounds that tore them apart. The aristocracy of the 18th century reveled in their excess, their wealth and power insulating them from the consequences of their actions. In the grand estates of Eastern Europe, parties of unimaginable decadence were held, where the finest wines flowed and the richest foods were served. But in the hidden chambers and secret forests, darker appetites were fed. There were whispers of nobles who would gather in remote castles, where the only rule was that there were no rules. As the century wore on and the fires of revolution began to burn across Europe, the stories of these hunts became more than just rumors. They became symbols of the corruption and cruelty of the aristocracy, proof that the nobles, with all their talk of enlightenment and reason, were nothing more than predators in fine clothes. Chapter 5. The Victorian Eras Grim Allegations. The Victorian era is often remembered for its propriety and decorum, with its rigid social structure, buttoned-up morality, and the ever-present eye of public judgment. Yet beneath the layers of silk, lace, and civility, there was a far darker undercurrent that flowed through the drawing rooms and country estates of England's elite. Whispers circulated through the smoky halls of gentlemen's clubs and opulent manors. Whispers of aristocratic men and women whose appetites extended far beyond the rules of polite society. They were rumors of manhunts, vile, predatory games played in the privacy of sprawling estates where no one could hear the screams. Behind the manicured hedges and perfectly kept gardens, where society's elite hosted weekend parties and afternoon teas, lurked a macabre secret: the alleged practice of hunting humans. It was said that some of England's most powerful families took part in these grisly games, their immense wealth and influence allowing them to indulge in the most depraved of fantasies. To the public, they were the epitome of refinement, but in the shadows, they were something far more sinister. One of the most notorious figures shrouded in such rumors was King Edward VII, then the Prince of Wales, whose excesses were well known even in his time. Famous for his indulgence in all manner of hedonistic pleasures, his lavish lifestyle was no secret. However, the rumors that swirled in hushed tones at the peripheries of Victorian society told a much darker story. According to certain scandalous whispers, Edward was involved in a secret circle of aristocrats who participated in human hunts on secluded estates, far from the prying eyes of London's high society. These hunts were not conducted in daylight, but in the dead of night, under the cover of the English countryside's heavy fog. The prey, usually servants or drifters who had no family to speak for them, were given a brief chance to run before the hounds were set loose. The prince and his companions would ride after them on horseback, their faces hidden by masks, their laughter echoing through the woods like something out of a nightmare. The victims had no hope of escape. The terrain was treacherous, and the hunters knew it well. The hunt was not over until the prey was either captured or dead, their bodies discarded as easily as an animal's. Even more chilling were the tales from Britain's sprawling colonial empire. The sun never set on the British Empire, and neither, it seemed, did the cruelty of its rulers. In the far reaches of India and Africa, British officers were rumored to partake in the most horrifying of hunting games. The locals whispered of entire villages being taken over, the men forced to flee into the wilderness as the officers hunted them down for sport. These hunts were not games of chance. They were orchestrated slaughter. Armed with rifles and accompanied by packs of ferocious dogs, the officers pursued their human prey through jungles and deserts, reveling in the bloodshed that followed. There were stories of British aristocrats in India using native servants as human game, turning the vast estates of the Raj into deadly hunting grounds. Under the guise of punishing unruly subjects, they would gather for what appeared to be traditional hunts. But instead of deer or tiger, it was human beings who became the quarry. With nowhere to hide, the hunted were driven to exhaustion, collapsing in the scorching heat, only to be dispatched by a bullet or slashed open by a sword. These hunts were considered entertainment for the ruling class, and in the silence that followed, the jungle was left to swallow the bodies. Perhaps the most disturbing tale of all emerged from London's very heart, casting a dark shadow over the aristocracy that still lingers today. It was a cold and foggy autumn in the East End of London when the city was gripped by fear, and whispers of Jack the Ripper stalked the cobbled streets. The murders were brutal, calculated, and terrifying. Women, often destitute and living on the edge of society, were found mutilated in grotesque ways, their bodies discarded like butchered livestock. While the police scrambled to find a suspect, rumors began to circulate that the Ripper was not an ordinary madman, but someone from the highest echelons of British society. Some conspiracy theorists claimed that the killer was a member of the royal family itself, or at the very least, someone with connections so powerful that they were untouchable by law. According to these whispers, the killings were not random acts of violence, but part of a twisted game, a royal hunt played out in the grimy streets of Whitechapel. The victims were selected not by chance, but by design, chosen for their vulnerability and invisibility. The Ripper, it was said, was a predator of the most chilling kind, one who wore a crown by day and a blood-stained cloak by night. As the stories grew, so too did the fear. The idea that someone as high-ranking as a member of the royal family could be behind such monstrous acts was too horrifying for many to even consider, and yet the rumors persisted. After all, who else could evade capture so easily, slipping through the fog like a ghost, leaving no trace but terror in their wake? The countryside estates of England were not immune to such dark tales either. Large, sprawling properties, often inherited through generations of aristocracy, became the setting for stories of unspeakable horror. It was said that certain lords and ladies, bored by the typical fox hunts, would turn their attention to a much more thrilling chase: human prey. Peasants who worked the land were said to be coerced into participating, told that if they survived the night, they would be granted freedom or coin. But survival was never in the cards. The estate grounds were vast, labyrinthine, and well patrolled by guards with orders to shoot anyone who dared to escape. Those who ran had little chance of making it to dawn. The aristocrats, riding their horses, would hunt them down with glee. The hunts were swift but brutal, and the bodies were never seen again. Some said they were buried in unmarked graves, while others claimed they were simply left to rot in the wilderness, consumed by the very dogs that had chased them down. As the Victorian era drew to a close, these tales of cruelty and horror continued to haunt the public imagination. While society obsessed over appearances and decorum, the unspoken truth was that behind closed doors, the elite were capable of unspeakable evil. The line between civilization and barbarity was thinner than anyone cared to admit, and the upper class, those who controlled wealth, power, and influence, played by rules of their own. Even as the world entered the modern age, the ghostly echoes of these hunts remained, lingering in the minds of those who dared to look beyond the polished exterior of Victorian society. For in the end, it was not the jungle or the wilderness that was home to the most dangerous predators. It was the stately homes and grand manors, where privilege, power, and bloodlust intertwined in the darkest of ways. Chapter 6: 20th Century Aristocratic Cruelties. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it industrial progress, the promise of modernity, and 2 world wars that scarred the globe. Yet, even amidst the horrors of war, behind the smoke of the battlefields and the political upheavals, there were whispers, dark, unsettling whispers, of aristocrats and elites indulging in the most primitive, sadistic desires. As the world turned its eyes to the tragedies unfolding in trenches and cities, those in power were rumored to still engage in ancient rituals of cruelty, the hunting of human beings. The Belgian Congo, a place of unimaginable suffering, was one of the first to give rise to these terrifying rumors. King Leopold II of Belgium ruled over this African colony as his personal fiefdom, exploiting its resources with brutal efficiency. But stories from deep within the jungle whispered of something even more sinister than forced labor and mass exploitation. The rubber plantations, which claimed the lives of countless Congolese, became the stage for macabre tales of human sport hunting. It was said that workers who tried to escape the harsh conditions of Leopold's rubber fields were not simply punished but hunted down. Stories filtered out of the jungle about aristocrats, plantation owners, and even Belgian officers embarking on hunting expeditions, not for game, but for human lives. The runaway workers were given a head start, told they would be freed if they could make it across the dense jungle. But it was all a cruel lie. Armed with rifles, riding horseback, and accompanied by hunting dogs, the overseers would track their prey with merciless precision. The jungle was vast, and the workers' knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage. Some of them would escape, but others, exhausted and starving, would eventually fall to their knees, only to be gunned down, their bodies left to rot among the vines. These tales, spoken in hushed voices by survivors, cast Leopold II's regime as more than just an economic tyranny. It became an empire of fear, where life was a commodity to be traded, and death was a game for those who wielded power. But the horror did not end with the fall of Leopold's reign. Europe in the 20th century was marred by the rise of fascism and the violent ideologies that led to the systematic extermination of millions. In the heart of Nazi Germany, where brutality was state policy, there were accounts of twisted games played by those who held absolute power over life and death. At the center of these stories was Ilse Koch, the wife of Karl Otto Koch, commandant of the Buchenwald concentration camp. Ilse Koch, often referred to as the Witch of Buchenwald, became infamous for her sadistic tendencies, but the rumors surrounding her were far more chilling than the official record revealed. Survivors spoke of deadly games she orchestrated, where prisoners, emaciated, weak, and terrified, were set loose in the camp's expansive grounds. The guards, laughing cruelly, would take bets on how long the prisoners would last as they were hunted down. Koch, they said, took a particular pleasure in these hunts, watching from her balcony as the terrified men and women scrambled through the camp, only to be caught by the guards' dogs or gunned down for sport. It wasn't enough for Koch to control the prisoners through fear and starvation. She needed the thrill of the hunt, the power over life and death distilled into a grotesque game. The bodies of those who fell in these deadly games were often disposed of without record, their existence erased as easily as their lives had been taken. For those who survived, the memory of the hunt haunted them long after the war had ended. In post-war Europe, as the aristocracy struggled to maintain its relevance in a world transformed by conflict, the tabloids began to buzz with scandalous whispers. Wealthy elites, no longer satisfied with the excesses of their privileged lifestyles, were rumored to seek new, darker thrills. In certain circles, the whispers grew louder, suggesting that the hunts had returned, this time, hidden beneath the guise of exclusive parties held in remote estates. Invitations to these gatherings were coveted by the ultra-wealthy, but what truly happened behind the closed doors of these estates remained shrouded in mystery. One such rumor centered around a prominent European family, aristocrats who had survived the war with their fortunes intact. It was said that they hosted secret hunting parties, where the game was not deer or boar, but human beings. The victims, often trafficked from war-torn regions or plucked from the fringes of society, were brought to the estate under the cover of night. Stripped of their dignity and hope, they were told to run, to hide in the dense forests surrounding the estate. But escape was impossible. The hunters, armed with rifles and night vision goggles, stalked their prey with a cold, clinical precision. The thrill of the hunt was intoxicating for these aristocrats. The excitement of the chase, the fear in their victims' eyes, it was all part of the game. The victims, knowing their fate was sealed, often tried to fight back, but they were no match for the hunters' superior technology and weaponry. The hunt always ended the same way, with bodies hidden in shallow graves or incinerated in the estate's furnaces, leaving no trace of the horrors that had unfolded. These modern-day aristocratic hunts were not limited to Europe. Across the Atlantic, in the sprawling estates of America's wealthiest families, similar stories began to surface. There were whispers of billionaires indulging in human hunting games on private islands and in the dense forests of their expansive properties. The victims were often drifters or trafficked individuals, people who would not be missed. The rich and powerful, shielded by their money and influence, could indulge in their darkest fantasies without fear of retribution. One of the most chilling allegations came from a survivor, a woman who claimed to have escaped from a hunting party on an estate in the American South. She described being chased through the woods by men on horseback, their laughter echoing through the trees as she stumbled through the underbrush, her feet bleeding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dogs were released first, their growls sending waves of terror through her as she tried to hide. When they finally found her, she was dragged back to the mansion, where the hunters watched her with cold, calculating eyes. She managed to escape only because one of the hunters, drunk and careless, left a door unlocked. Her story, like so many others, was dismissed by the authorities as the ramblings of a disturbed woman. After all, who would believe that in the modern age, the rich and powerful were still indulging in such barbaric practices? But for those who had heard the rumors, her account was all too familiar. The hunt, it seemed, was not a thing of the past. It was a sport that had survived into the modern world, hidden behind the gilded walls of wealth and privilege. As the 20th century drew to a close, the stories of aristocratic hunts remained buried beneath the weight of skepticism and denial. But for those who dared to look beyond the surface, the truth was impossible to ignore. The wealthy elite, untouchable and insulated by their power, continued to play their deadly games, leaving a trail of blood and fear in their wake. The victims, like so many before them, became nothing more than prey, hunted, killed, and forgotten. Chapter 7. The Allegations of the Modern Day. In the dimly lit corners of the internet, on forums filled with cryptic usernames and anonymous accounts, a haunting narrative has emerged, one that connects the most powerful people in the world with acts so heinous they seem ripped from the pages of dystopian fiction. But these allegations are no fantasy. They speak of an underground world where the global elite, billionaires, politicians, and royals indulge in the darkest desires imaginable. Human trafficking, ritualistic abuse, and at the core of it all, the ultimate thrill, the hunting of humans. It begins with the infamous Pizzagate conspiracy, a theory that spread like wildfire during the 2016 U.S. presidential election. According to the claims, a seemingly innocuous pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. served as the front for a child trafficking ring run by elites. But the whispers didn't stop at trafficking. There were darker accusations, hinting that children were not just being sold but hunted. Eyewitness accounts, though thinly sourced, claimed that secret rooms existed beneath the establishment, where victims were released into wooded areas only to be pursued by their captors in a gruesome game of life and death. While Pizzagate was widely discredited, it was the spark that ignited a broader wave of conspiracy theories, drawing attention to the sinister acts supposedly perpetrated by the world's wealthiest. All eyes turned to Jeffrey Epstein, the billionaire whose private island, Little St. James, had long been a subject of suspicion. Epstein's connection to the most powerful figures, royals, politicians, and CEOs, added fuel to the fire. His island was rumored to be the stage for unimaginable horrors. But it wasn't just the allegations of sexual abuse that sent chills down the spines of investigators. Some survivors spoke of hunting parties, secret events where elites would gather, and humans, young and old, would be the prey. One survivor, whose account was shared only in the shadowy realms of conspiracy websites, claimed to have been trafficked to Epstein's island as a teenager. She described being led into the island's remote areas late at night, where she and others were told to run. Men in dark clothing, armed with night vision goggles, then searched for them. She recalled the thrill of terror that surged through her as she sprinted blindly through the trees, hearing the distant crack of gunfire and the panicked screams of others in the darkness. Somehow, By hiding beneath a fallen tree trunk, she survived the night. But she was eventually captured, not by the hunters, but by those who ran the island, dragged back to a fate just as terrifying as the hunt itself. Her story, like so many others, was dismissed by authorities, chalked up to the ravings of a troubled mind. But for those who followed the clues, it was yet another piece of a terrifying puzzle. Epstein's death in 2019 only deepened the mystery. With his demise, much of the damning evidence was buried, but the rumors of human hunting didn't die with him. Instead, they found new life. The theory expanded, encompassing not just the elite of America, but global players. There were whispers of billionaires hosting private events on yachts drifting in international waters, where the rules of law did not apply. These events, according to some accounts, featured everything from ritualistic abuse to human hunts, all under the watchful eyes of security forces paid to ensure that no one left alive to tell the tale. Further east, another horrifying narrative began to take shape. Reports started to surface from Eastern Europe, where human trafficking rings were said to be supplying victims to underground aristocratic hunts. The Carpathian Mountains, with their remote and rugged terrain, were rumored to be the site of these deadly games. Local villagers spoke of hearing distant gunshots echoing through the mountains late at night, followed by the discovery of mutilated bodies days later. Authorities, when questioned, always blamed animal attacks or accidents, but the locals knew better. They knew what the elite were capable of. Even the world's most prestigious institutions were not immune from suspicion. The British royal family, already steeped in scandal throughout the 20th century, found themselves at the center of bizarre allegations. Some conspiracy theorists linked members of the royal family to the infamous Jack the Ripper murders, but modern allegations went even further. A theory surfaced, suggesting that certain high-ranking members of the royal family participated in ritualistic human hunts, events that were part of secret ceremonies tied to the most ancient traditions of the monarchy. These hunts, the theory claimed, took place on secluded estates, far from the prying eyes of the public, where victims, often trafficked from foreign countries, were released into the wild to be pursued by the royals. Perhaps the most unsettling of these modern-day accusations came from survivors of human trafficking rings who claimed they had been hunted by elites. In 2023, a woman from Eastern Europe, who escaped one such ring, gave a harrowing account in a clandestine interview. She described being taken to a remote estate in the Alps, where she and several others were held captive. One evening, she was told they were being given a chance to escape. Terrified, she and the others were released into the cold, forested terrain. As she ran, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her, followed by the howls of dogs. She could hear the laughter of her captors, distant but clear in the crisp mountain air. After hours of running, she was caught, dragged back to the estate, but the others weren't so fortunate. The next day, she saw the bodies of her fellow captives, displayed like trophies in the estate's hunting lodge. This woman's testimony, like so many before hers, was quickly buried. The powerful men and women accused remained untouchable, their wealth and influence too vast to penetrate. But the rumors never fully disappeared. They lived on, whispered in the dark recesses of the internet, passed between conspiracy theorists, each tale more chilling than the last. In a world where technology has made it harder to hide secrets, these stories persist, perhaps because the truth lies somewhere in the shadows. With every new allegation, every disturbing rumor, a pattern emerges, one that suggests the rich and powerful are not merely insulated by their privilege but emboldened by it. And as the 21st century progresses, these theories grow darker, leaving an unsettling question hanging in the air. What else are they hiding? The final, most terrifying piece of the puzzle surfaced just recently. A video, uploaded briefly to a dark web forum before being taken down, allegedly showed footage from one of these hunting parties. Though its authenticity was never verified, those who watched it described a scene of horror. Masked figures, moving through a dark forest, their laughter echoing through the trees as they stalked their prey. The prey, a woman, ran desperately through the underbrush, glancing over her shoulder, knowing her death was imminent. Though the video vanished as quickly as it appeared, the legend of the hunt endures. You've seen the dark side of power, and now you can't unsee it. The hunt has never stopped. It's just hidden deeper, behind closed doors you'll never be allowed to open. You may think you're safe, but what if you were the next one chosen? The elites are still playing their twisted game, and you might be their next victim. You won't know the truth until it's too late.